Good morning. I'm going to try and make this one a little bit shorter than yesterday's one, as I know that was quite long. I'm still trying to work out kind of the timings with it. So, in terms of the one for today, we're going to focus on the kind of educational conflict, moving past the headmaster and thinking about the kind of different teachers. We're going to focus primarily on Erwin and Hector and link back into that idea that we introduced with Hamlet in relation to the kind of foil character. Okay, so we want to recall on that kind of foil character type. We want to understand and sort of, we'd still need to be thinking about Hamlet, even though we're not doing it at the moment. You'll have your mocks at some point. Obviously, it's on the exam paper next year, so quick recall around that. We want to kind of contextualize the educational framework in which this kind of foil character system kind of appears. So, what do Erwin and Hector represent in terms of different educational styles? And then we're kind of moving into it, what ways they can be kind of interpreted as foil characters, and starting to kind of identify points in the play where Bennett draws this out, and we need to kind of think in terms of the techniques he uses to do this. Okay. So, what I'd like you to do to start with, we talked a lot with Hamlet about kind of Laertes as a foil to Hamlet. I want you to dig out your Hamlet text from wherever you've got them put at the moment. I want you to kind of just consider how each of those three pairings, Hamlet can be considered a foil character in relation to Laertes, Ophelia, and in relation to Fortinbras. So I want you to have a look, see if you can find evidence around it. Just think in a general way, how could you make this as an argument? Because especially, well, if it appeared in an extract, you might point it out and use it to kind of show how Shakespeare's creating this effect in the extract, or it might become an important line of argument in the second question where you're kind of debating a point more directly. Okay, so what I'd like to do, pause me for the moment, just a quick recall, spend kind of 10 minutes or so, think back over Hamlet, see what bits of evidence you could pick out. How can you evidence all three of those as kind of foil characters to Hamlet? Okay, and pause me now. Okay, so hopefully you've had a kind of a think about it. I mean, just kind of draw out some general points. Remember, Laertes acts very quickly. Laertes acts on impulse, unlike Hamlet, so he kind of contrasts with Hamlet. But because he's acting on impulse, it does lead him to kind of immoral behaviour. I think if I was going to pick out the one line that kind of reflects this best, Laertes says to Claudius to cut his throat in the church. So unlike Hamlet, who's approached Claudius, who is praying from behind, has kind of held back from the killing motion, has kind of considered, Laertes appears to be again far more impetuous. He would murder Hamlet in a church. That would not hold him back, but there's an inherent kind of immorality to this. With Ophelia, whereas Hamlet's madness is kind of dubious, and whilst he considers suicide, he doesn't carry out the act. For Ophelia, she does, and her madness appears far more genuine and disturbing. Yes, there's a kind of, there's truths that she draws out through it, but it does appear a more genuine type of madness. So again, you want to think kind of, maybe what the priest says at the funeral. Her death was doubtful, and but that great command oversways the order. She should in ground unsanctified have been lodged till the last trumpet. So it suggests that he views this as a suicide, that she shouldn't be buried in sanctified ground. That, yeah, where Hamlet has kind of debated with the idea, Ophelia has actually carried it out. So again, you get something slightly more impetuous on that side. And then you get kind of Hamlet and Fortinbras, and Fortinbras is again, like Hamlet, he's a kind of a young prince. He is affected by the death of his father, and Hamlet envies him because, unlike Hamlet, he acts. So think about his soliloquy in Act 4, Scene 4. Witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed, make mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. So, unlike Hamlet, he will act even where there is kind of minimal cause. He becomes a foil to Hamlet. He draws out Hamlet's indecision and his inaction. So each of them serve to kind of contrast Hamlet, to kind of draw out the difference. Okay. Now, this same idea is used in The History Boys. This is something you potentially want to talk about. It will help you hit that kind of criteria of talking about the kind of the dramatic effects within it, and a kind of overall narrative method as part of it. So what you kind of consider next is the kind of overall debate around education, and we've kind of touched on this before. Should education be exam focused, or should it be focused on creating well-rounded individuals? And you want to kind of just spend a few minutes picking holes in either side of this, because whilst both sides have their attraction, both sides also have their flaws to it as well. Okay, so just spend it again, pause me just for a couple of minutes this time, just for sort of 2-3 minutes, just run it round in your head, place it in your mind, because this is what Bennett's reflecting. This is kind of contextual message that comes through. Okay, so hopefully what you've been kind of thinking here is, well, we do kind of need exams. I know the current situation is not the best example of this, but you do need something that allows a decision of a student's kind of progress. You need that kind of, you know, a point that allows comparison across students. But the problem with the exam-based structure is that you are essentially opening up the opportunity to kind of just teach to a specific section. So you're quite narrow in terms of your teaching and learning. You are not necessarily teaching enjoyable things. You're forced into teaching kind of, you know, specific things, set things. And in many ways it places a lot of pressure and a lot of kind of constrictions onto the students. They're being judged very harshly on something very narrow. So there are dangers to it, but you need some form of assessment. In many ways, this year's system might be considered better because it's a kind of more holistic judgment of a student across their time in college. We'll see exactly how it pans out. If you focus on creating the well-rounded individual, well, students don't necessarily understand how they're going to apply that knowledge, what context it appears in. They don't understand the purposes that go with it a lot of the time. It doesn't have a set agenda to it. And very often that can mean that people don't engage with it in quite the same way. They don't push themselves because they know they're not necessarily going to be assessed on it directly. So it allows people to kind of lapse. And it just appears purposeless, at least in the short term. It appears purposeless. So there's problems with both views, and essentially Bennett is arguably, as we go through, showing that you need kind of both halves together in many ways, but that when you try and bring these two halves together, they don't always fit, that there is a conflict, there is danger in trying to kind of push them together. Okay, so we go in and we're thinking about the text. Now, you need to have a look at the introduction of both of the figures here. You're literally only looking at a very small section at the start when both of them are introduced. So Hector's very early on, just after the Erwin bit, and Erwin slightly later on. I've got the page references in a moment. What you need to consider, though, is the choice in terms of casting, in terms of age. You need to consider the ways in which each is introduced. So how are they introduced? And you should start to think how they're characterized as different and which one Bennett creates arguably more sympathy for. Again, these are debatable points. You can take what I'm saying, you can kind of use it, you can challenge it. When it comes to your coursework, you don't have to be in agreement with me here, but you need to kind of think around how this kind of characterization is created. So what you need to look at very quickly is just on page 3 onto page 4 where Hector's introduced. Think about how he's introduced. Think about any kind of implications here. So he comes on stage, that dress, how old he is, and I want you to then compare it to the introduction of Erwin. What's different about the introduction of Erwin? How is he kind of brought in? It touches on some of the things we mentioned yesterday with the headmaster, but you just need to look kind of very quickly and think about what it is that's different in terms of their initial presentation. Okay, so again, pause me. I'd say this should only take you kind of 5 minutes or so. Just have a quick look, see what initial annotations you would make around it. Okay, so let's think about Hector to start with. He initially appears and he dressed all in his kind of motorcycle leather. So think about the kind of symbolism that can go with this. What we think of when we think of kind of bikers, and we kind of, it's seen as a kind of form of rebellion. There's a kind of subversiveness to it. There's also something kind of heroic in it. Think about the name Hector. It's, again, you do a bit of research around it, but it's a kind of classical allusion here. It's, Bennett's chosen this name. There isn't a real Hector. Hector's a character of Bennett. Hector's from the Iliad by Homer. He's one of the Trojan heroes. He dies. He's kind of killed by Achilles and dragged around behind the chariot for a long time. It's kind of brutal until kind of Priam comes and begs for the corpse back. He's kind of dragged round and round and round. So there's something heroic, but also we're aware of a potential destruction here. We know that the Hector from classical mythology dies, so what's going to happen to this Hector? And think about the way the boys kind of undress him. There's something kind of academic, something heroic in it. You get the use of the French, and it shows them as kind of well educated as they do so. And the kind of the final item to be removed, finally the helmet is removed, and it reveals Hector, and he's in his 50s, so it kind of, we've got an old man here, and he's kind of underneath. Hector is a man of studied eccentricity who wears a bow tie. There's something in Hector of the kind of the old school, something different, something that marks him out as different. You compare this then into kind of Erwin's introduction, and Erwin is a young man, about 25 or so. So Bennett has chosen these kind of different figures. One is the old guard of education, one is the newer kind of figures coming into the education system. Scripts are kind of narrative voice, kind of within the structure of a play. He's not a narrative voice in the same way, but he sort of states, I thought he was a new boy. He thought he was kind of, he looks young. He might be 25, but he looks young enough to be a student. So again, we're showing a conflict between kind of old ideals and new ideals. And again, as we kind of come back to what we mentioned yesterday, so I won't go into it in massive detail, the way that Bennett creates this introduction, and there's something subversive about it. He beckons Irwin cagily into the study. So our adverb there, cagily, it's something. Why is he doing this? There's a clear understanding that they're doing something wrong almost. And Scripps calls it clandestine, and again, that implies something kind of subversive around it. So we've got the kind of seemingly heroic entrance of Hector, although there is the kind of eccentricities that go with it. There is then the kind of contrasting introduction of Irwin with its kind of more subversive elements that go with it. The other bit to mention while we're on it, with the introduction of Hector, you can use that introduction in relation to kind of gender and sexuality as well, because think about the implications of kind of Hector covering himself over with that very typically masculine kind of garb, and how that kind of is then stripped away to reveal the inner Hector, what he's hiding underneath in terms of his kind of sexuality. So that's another way to use it as well. Right, you then want to kind of go through the play, and again, there are other things that kind of mark them out as both similar and different in terms of this. Their views on kind of exams, on kind of higher education, and how do they both view it? Do they see it as important? Where do they see it as important? How do they kind of present it to us? You want to think there are commonalities here. They both point out things. So Foyle isn't somebody totally different. They're going to share some similarities, and they both draw out things that show the pressure placed on the boys, show a kind of shared ideal around this, although there are differences in the way they'll engage with it. So yeah, there are differences in the perception and the way they'll engage with the process. I mean, obviously, Hector's more reluctant, and Irwin is quite happy to kind of facilitate this move into higher education, to game the system, whereas Hector is completely detached from this. Right, for this one, I want you to use kind of page 6, page 19 to 20. Again, try and point out kind of techniques, try and think about how there's a similarity in the way that they depict the education system, and how there's also differences in the ways they will engage with it. This is something that cuts much further across the play. You can find other bits as well as this. These are just the bits that I'll be kind of focusing in on in a minute. Okay, so try and find what you can start with. As I say, don't just listen to me through. You should be looking first. There are other bits that I won't pick up on, and you need to build this kind of skill set as you go, of, you being willing to look at a text to kind of draw out the ideas yourself. Okay, so just spend 5-10 minutes looking at those pages, seeing what you can draw out in terms of similarity and difference. Okay, so what we note potentially then from Hector in terms of his views of kind of higher education can kind of be talked about referencing kind of a lot of different techniques. On page 6, you get kind of Dakin saying, well, we're all going to Oxford and Cambridge, and Hector's response to this is not a positive response. He sees these kind of very prestigious institutions as being potentially destructive. Now, this is something that I would recommend that you kind of research around more overall with the play. Be looking this up as you look up with the play. You've got various intertextual allusions here, and intertextual allusions to Shakespeare in this case. And there are lots of intertextual allusions across the history, boys. And Bennett has chosen them for a reason. They have a purpose very often. The first one comes from Othello, "Wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire," where it's Othello kind of scourging himself. He's he's killed Desdemona, and he's realised that he's killed her in error, that he's been led to this by the kind of corrupt forces of Iago. So think about how that kind of filters into Hector's views of this education system, that they've been led to it by a kind of corrupt force whispering in their ear as if they're friends to this. And he kind of rejects it. I thought all this silliness was finished. So simply talking about the adjective, it's silliness, and that he thinks about kind of Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, even my own dear Sheffield, as, you know, they're good institutions. He is happy with them. And he says, you know, he challenges, and again, this way you should start to have seen parallels to Irwin. He challenges the reasons that the boys want to go there, and through this, essentially, Bennett is challenging the reasons that these are seen as the kind of most prestigious institutions. It's not just Hector challenging it, it's Alan Bennett challenging it. He says, no, it's because other boys want to go there. It's the hot ticket, standing room only. So he's using a kind of metaphorical language here. It's the hot ticket. It's because it's competitive, because you're told you want to go there, because you're told it's the best, you want to go there. It's not that it's genuinely the best. It's all a matter of kind of perception of it. It's not the boys that genuinely will be better there. So as you think about those kind of questions, the dangers of education, think how that could fit in. In fact, here, in many ways, Hector might see himself as, if you're thinking of the abuse question, seeking to protect the boys rather than to abuse the boys. And he kind of, the section I'm kind of thinking about here, he says at the end of it, there is a world elsewhere. And this is Coriolanus. And again, Bennett may well be making a point through this as another intertextual allusion. Coriolanus, he's kind of cast out of Rome, but he returns in kind of fire and fury. He returns in a kind of destructive pattern. He's been rejected by his peers in Rome, and he's going to return in fury. Now, Irwin, we are then kind of thinking page 19 to 20. And Irwin again shows an awareness that they're in a competitive system. He says, has anyone been to Rome? He kind of he questions it. He kind of rhetorically questions. He goes on to answer this himself. Well, you will be competing against boys and girls who have, and they will have been to Rome and Venice, Florence, and all of these disadvantages they're put at. But again, it's the competition element that he's focusing on. But unlike Hector, he is willing to kind of facilitate the process to push them there. And you get the kind of, it's semi-comical, you get the references to the kind of the 14 foreskins of Christ, and they'll think they've won the pools. So the kind of analogy here, that they're looking for interest, that it's about the kind of shock factor, it's about gaming the system with it. There are things that draw them together, though. Oh no, sorry, before I go on to that. And he kind of, his language becomes imperative, and he kind of continues the metaphor. He talks about the more privileged students, so you can start thinking another danger in the education system here is that you can kind of pay your way into the education system. That the more prestigious schools you've gone to earlier on, the more chances you've got of getting into those prestigious institutions down the line. He says, hate them because these boys and girls against whom you are to compete have been groomed like thoroughbreds for this one particular race. So we start off with the imperative here. He's commanding them. He's telling them to hate these other people because they're in competition with them. And he says, you know, he compares them to horses. Using the simile here, they've been groomed like thoroughbreds for this one particular race. So Hector and Erwin are both aware of the competitive angle here, but whereas Hector kind of seeks to remove them from the competition to protect them from it, Erwin is quite happy to facilitate the competition, to allow them to game the system, to kind of think about it in the right way. But there's similarity with Erwin as well. He kind of, with the question, so why are we bothering even? You want it, I imagine, or your parents want it. The headmaster certainly wants it, but I wouldn't waste the money judging by these. There is no point. Go to Newcastle and be happy. So like Hector, he's aware that this is a decision that's not necessarily the boys' own, that it's been pushed onto them by an outside force that you could talk about here. You want it, I imagine. That kind of comment clause at the end there kind of suggests an uncertainty around whether they want it. And then you get the kind of conjunction, or your parents want it, that this has been pushed on by kind of somebody outside of it. So you can kind of talk around those kind of social pressures towards it. Right, as we move on, we'll just point out kind of a few bits here that kind of allow us to talk about it a bit further. The conflict is gradually built up through the play. We don't see them teaching next to each other to start with, but as the play progresses, we see them kind of coming closer together. So initially, we see them teaching alone. So think about how those different lessons pan out, how they're depicted teaching alone. As we then go kind of further through, we see them actually discussing it more directly. We have that sit-down conversation between Hector and Erwin says, I'd like them to use more of your things. So you need to kind of consider across the play how there is a distance created in terms of how they deliver the material. I'm going to suggest some page references, but there are lots of places you could look for this. There are other points we could make in terms of different types of kind of almost abuse that come into this. And there are bits where Bennett draws them together, though, so where he shows that they're not necessarily as incompatible as they might seem in terms of that delivery. I would suggest you're using around page 33, which is actually it's kind of Mrs. Lintott and Rudge, but Rudge is discussing with Lintott Mr. Erwin's teaching, and he's kind of drawing out the contrasts in Erwin's teaching to both her own and Hector's. How does Bennett kind of set that up? I would suggest you use page 38 to 41. As one of those where they're in Erwin's classroom, but they're talking about Hector's teaching, and the students don't seem to see it as compatible with Erwin's type lessons. And I would suggest that you also look at page 48 and 49 and kind of consider how that discourse between Erwin and Hector plays out, what you could draw out from that to kind of demonstrate them as kind of different in their educational styles, the kind of different dangers or problems that kind of stem out from this, okay? So again, pause me for a bit here. I want you to reread those pages, have a look, see what you could draw out in relation to this. What bits would you highlight? Because I'm not going to be talking about every word. It doesn't mean that other bits of it aren't just as valid, okay? Just for the sake of time. So pause me again for a little bit. Okay, so with the kind of exchange between Rudge and Mrs. Lintott, you can kind of talk around the fact that whereas Mrs. Lintott has given them the facts in a kind of sensible order, it's clear that what Erwin's sort of, or the implication around Erwin is that that is not enough, that Erwin is about kind of polishing this. So you get this kind of extended metaphor of the students turned into kind of battery chickens, essentially. And whereas Mrs. Lintott has force-fed them the facts, Mr. Irwin is more free range. And he's kind of pushing a kind of a more unconventional way of viewing the material. He's moving away from kind of classics. He's kind of pushing the kind of unconventional ideas. So you get the reference to the Carry On films, which just, you lot are far too young for the Carry On films. Even I'm too young for the Carry On films, really. And they're essentially kind of comedy in a kind of low way. And Irwin here is kind of arguing that they have value, but it's through simply the fact that they persist that they have value. He's pushing these arguments that are simply about show rather than any true merit. It's about finding the angles he references elsewhere, remember. So Orwell gets kind of dismissed almost. Mr. Irwin says that if Orwell was alive, he'd be in the National Front, as opposed to the Carry On films, which have a permanence, achieve some of the permanence of art simply by persisting. So those references to kind of, again, different authors and different other mediums become important. And it shows Irwin's style of teaching, this kind of showy element that goes with it. That Rudge here is kind of depicted by Bennett as maybe starting to understand, but he doesn't necessarily understand entirely. He describes himself as kind of picking up flavour, but he says, I don't understand why there are none in the school library. So he doesn't quite understand the argument necessarily in relation to this. With kind of page 38 to 39, you get kind of the direct reference here. Mr. Hector's stuff's not meant for the exam, sir. It's to make us more rounded human beings. So everything Hector's teaching them, they can't, at the present point in the play, they can't see how it fits to the exam. Irwin's going to kind of make them fit it to the exam, but in a kind of diminished way later on. But he's kind of pushing this view, or Tim's here is showing this view even, that they don't understand. They see these two forms of education, Hector's and Irwin's, as separate. Hector's not meant for the exam, and metaphorically it's to make them well-rounded human beings. Whereas Irwin is presented as kind of challenging this. The examination will be about everything. But they see it, and a lot of the time with Hector, there's kind of religious language used around Hector. So we couldn't do that, sir. That would be a betrayal of trust, laying bare our souls. Is nothing sacred, sir? We're shocked. They kind of imply that Hector's lessons have created a kind of a reverence that to use those things in the exam, it takes away from them, essentially. And whilst Posner is kind of depicted here saying, well, they actually would, you know, there is that kind of disconnect between the two, essentially. Okay, and then we come to page 48 and 49, where you get Hector and Irwin kind of directly discussing their views. And Hector makes these kind of ironic statements. Bennett gives a kind of deliberate irony to these. You get Hector saying, well, I count examinations, even for Oxford and Cambridge, as the enemy of education. He kind of personifies the examinations. They become the antagonist in this sense. They actually prevent education because they narrow it so much. He even describes education as the enemy of education. There's a sense of paradox here. How can education be the enemy of education? It's kind of that self conflict here that he's kind of presenting. So Hector on one side of the divide is presented as seeing kind of the current educational status quo as destructive, diminishing, preventing students from kind of learning in a broad sense. And Irwin kind of seeks to challenge him on this, but there is a sense that what Hector has been teaching them has been reduced through Irwin's kind of teaching. He sort of says, I'm sure you want them to do well with the gobbets you've taught them. They might just tip the balance. Where I think gobbet is an interesting word here. I use it now, having read the play, where it's those little bits. Gobbet is kind of a part of something, just a small bit of it. And it's the implication that he's just been giving them these little bits that they can kind of trot out. There's something reductive about this, that these are parts of a poem or a text as a whole. It's not the whole thing, it's just a little gobbet to kind of add flavour here. And Hector is presented here in terms of his characterization as kind of horrified by this reductive nature of this new style of education that Irwin is putting. This kind of series of kind of interrogatives, these rhetorical questions. Gobbets, is that what you think they are? Gobbets, handy little quotes that can be trotted out to make a point. Gobbets, code, spells, runes, call them what you like, but do not call them gobbets. So he kind of, the interrogatives suggest an outrage, and that closing kind of imperative, you call them this, but don't call them gobbet. Don't reduce what he sees as kind of beautiful and sacred to the status of just something for an exam. That is dangerous. That is kind of hurtful, essentially. They're learnt by heart. And again, think about the way that Bennett's doing this. You're thinking about technique. You're not just describing what they say. Learnt by heart. The italics there, the prosodic stress, he doesn't just mean learnt by heart in terms of they've memorized it. It means something internalized and emotional that the education system through exams takes away. Okay, and again, the last bit to kind of point out from within this bit is that Irwin says to Hector, the knowledge is for now, the exam is next month. The temporal markers here are kind of time markers, show that Irwin sees this for a specific purpose, whereas Hector kind of rhetorically questions, and what happens after the exam? Well, life happens after the exam, he kind of says, or life goes on, and it's about, again, that conflict in educational styles, the exam focus rather than the well-rounded human being focus. And here there's a sense of them still in conflict. Right, so last couple of bits to kind of do around this. You've got the actual conflict within the classroom, okay? So the main bit that you're kind of focusing on here is the kind of the Holocaust scene, where they are essentially kind of team teaching, and yet there's a real sense of conflict around that. They start off together, and you're thinking about how there's a kind of heightened tension in this scene with Hector on one side and Irwin on the other. So what you need to be kind of annotating for here, what you need to be picking out, is the ways in which this conflict is played out, and the ideas of kind of danger and abuse coming into it, the Holocaust as a kind of emotive topic. How is it being dealt with? How is it being kind of reduced? How are Hector's kind of words coming into this but being twisted to a new purpose, a more immoral kind of purpose around it. So you're looking at kind of page 70 to 74 for this. And again, I want you to spend some time. I think this is one of the key scenes of the play. Have a go at annotating around it, see what you can draw out of it in terms of that conflict. How does Bennett shape that conflict? What kind of things does he use? What kind of techniques does he use around the stagecraft, around the language choices? How does he create a conflict? Okay, so again, pause me for a little bit, have a look over. Okay, so the first thing to kind of note here is that kind of Dakins, one of his opening remarks, we don't know who we are, sir, your class or Mr. Irwin's. So through this discourse, you do get the sense of, again, they still can't see the link between the two different lessons, essentially. They still see them as separate entirely. So when you've got this kind of perspective, what then happens is we kind of see them drawing them together, but at the same time in a kind of disturbing way. The other thing to kind of bear in mind as you look at this, again, you can view it in two separate ways. There's something disturbing in the way that they're kind of presented talking about the Holocaust, but there's also something academic around it. The discussion they're having is sophisticated. There is a kind of intellectual element to it. It's interesting, and it shows them thinking in a very critical way. They are genuinely kind of intelligent in the way that they deal with this. So various bits that you might point out. Well, it's Irwin's sort of an issue, but the syllabus includes the Second World War. So it's something imposed, it has to be taught. But to talk about the Holocaust, to teach it, and kind of Irwin poses this as a question: should you teach the Holocaust? Anybody? And you then get this kind of extended discussion. As I say, it is very academic. They are critically analysing this, but there's something reductive within it. And Hector is presented as kind of horrified by this. Where do they drink their Coke? Do they take pictures of each other? Are they smiling? Do they hold hands? Nothing is appropriate. So from Hector's perspective, he can't see how you can teach the Holocaust, or in that kind of detached way. Whereas for Irwin, he's actually kind of impressed by what's going on, the way that he's actually kind of manipulated the students. He keeps saying good, and it's actually distressing Hector and Posner more and more as you go through the scene, and Bennett kind of suggests that this is kind of the price you pay almost. You're distressing people, you're taking away that emotional element, and that is kind of destructive. So anyway, sorry, just had to double check my bits that I want to talk about. You get Hector, he says it's journalism, that it's simply reduced to something showy is the implication here, that it's more about entertainment and kind of interest than true academics. And he kind of further down, no, not good. Posner is not making a point. He's speaking from the heart. So Irwin here is the suggestion from Hector is that Irwin is kind of confusing an academic point with an emotional point, that the two are not kind of, or that there's a disconnect between the two even. And the whole thing kind of ends up with it kind of gradually escalating with the discussion of Hitler and turning him around and, justifying his actions. it becomes disturbing, as I say, but at the same time, there's a logic to it. Politician, then, and one erratically perhaps, but still discernibly operated within the framework of traditional German foreign policy, where Dakin is able to kind of legitimize Hitler. He's able to kind of give him reasoning, and that can be dangerous because if you give it reason, if you give it justification, the implication is that somebody else will find that same justification, somebody else will continue the pattern. And again, the other bits with kind of Hector seeing it as reductive, simply talking about etc., where it's kind of, you know, something implied, something left out, that there's a continuation that goes unstated, but it's reductive to the whole thing, and Hector is horrified by this. He sees it as destructive within it. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, the other bit to point out just very quickly from this section, Dakin within it is also presented as kind of taking Hector's words, actually using them as gobbets. We see this in action, those kind of gobbets being used against Hector. So he kind of, whereof one cannot speak, therefore one must be silent. That's right, isn't it, sir? Wittgenstein. He's using what Hector has taught him, and he's taking it and using it in this kind of discussion where they're placing the Holocaust in proportion. So what you're seeing here, what Bennett's showing us, is that, well, in some ways these two education systems can work together, but where this happens, there is something reductive about it, that there's something disturbing at the same time in this kind of process. Okay, final couple of points. It looks like we're going to make it slightly shorter than the one yesterday, but not as much maybe as hoped. So the final close, where both of them are on the motorbike, I think this is an important point. We mentioned this again yesterday in relation to the head teacher that time, but what you see within that accident is something symbolic. Hector dies, Erwin is kind of maimed for life. Now just think as a kind of closing point about what that implies about these two systems of education, that they might work together, but very often they work out of harmony. It's that Erwin leans out the wrong way that causes the accident, and both of these kind of representations of these educational systems end up one dead, the other kind of maimed, and no one wins essentially. So Bennett doesn't give us a definitive view, but there is that sense that we need a new balance. We need to kind of make the systems work together and see that working together. We need to stop placing them in conflict. Otherwise, we're going to have kind of damage done, essentially. Okay, last bit I can leave you with. I want you to read the article I've got on the blog. It's only a short one. It's just about kind of the ways in which some of the students start to mirror the teachers' dialogue, the things that they've taught them from earlier on. And I think that's, again, it's useful in terms of the method, in terms of the way that you can talk around this text and the things that you can kind of point out in terms of Bennett's narrative method. So it kind of outlines the ways in which some students have been affected by Hector more, others by kind of Erwin more. Okay, but that's it for today, people. I will upload again another one on Friday for you lot, and that will be around your last Plath poem, which will be Daddy. Okay, and just kind of setting up around the coursework for that. Okay, bye bye for now.